So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Tokyo College lecture series. My name is Michael Fatius. I'm an associate professor at Tokyo College and I'm the moderator for today's session. The title of today's lecture is Leadership, Hereditary Monarchy and Ruling Empires, the Place of the Emperor in World History. I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Professor Dominic LIEVEN. Professor LIEVEN is a historian of modern Russian history and of empire. He's an honorary fellow at Trinity College at Cambridge University. He's also fellow of the British Academy and an honorary academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences. His publications include Empire, the Russian Empire and its Rivals, and his very recent book, In the Shadow of the Gods, the Emperor in World History, which will also be the theme that Professor LIEVEN will be talking about today. As for today's session, we will begin with the lecture by Professor LIEVEN, which will last for around 50 minutes, and we will then hear a comment of about 15 minutes by Professor HANEDA Masashi. Professor HANEDA is the director of the college and also a leading scholar in global and world history. And the remaining time will be used for. With that said, thank you again for joining us, Professor LIEVEN, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is my book, which was published in Britain and the United States last summer 2023. The book is called In the Shadow of the Gods, the Emperor in World History. The book really is about a job, and even more to the point about the people who did that job. And the job was ruling empires. The book covers 5 millennia back to the earliest origins of empire and down to 1945. And it is a global history, though I have to admit it says very little about sub-Saharan Africa or the Americas before 1500. In one sense, the book is biography, collection of biographies. In another, it is really a study of leadership. In a third sense, it is an anatomy of a particular kind of political system, hereditary monarchy, a system which has dominated most of world history, or predominated in most of world history. And then finally, it is about ruling empires, about the challenges facing the rulers of empires and the qualities which contributed to success or failure. Obviously, this is a vast subject. It was almost impossible to cover such a vast subject in a 500-page book. It is completely impossible to do so in a 50-minute lecture. So all I will do, roughly speaking, following the lines of my first introductory chapter in the book, is to set out some of the elements which go into the book and relate a few of my basic conclusions, etc., etc. All right, that's just a brief introduction to what I'm going to say. It seems to me that 4 elements really went into the makeup of the people whom I studied in the book. In the first place, they were human beings. Secondly, they were leaders. Thirdly, they were hereditary monarchs. And it's worth mentioning that I concentrate mostly on people, usually but not always men, who inherited the rule over empire. I spend less time on the founders of dynasties. And fourthly, as suggested, I'm looking at what it means to rule empires. So there are 4 elements, and let me start with the first, which is being a human being. Now, it may seem astonishingly banal and obvious to start with the implications of being a human being in my book. But actually, one purpose of my book is precisely to be a bit banal. Much of the academic discussion of empire can, as academic discussion of many topics, can be a bit abstruse, obscure. So it is worth stressing that at the core of my book is human beings doing a job. Now, you know, being a human being has some inherent elements to it. Human beings are by nature sociable. We need society. Most of us need friends. Most of us need love. Most of us certainly need sex. One of the things that is interesting, for me at least, about the topic is what happens when very human needs are experienced by the ruler of an empire. Friendship, a good example. Emperors did, in most cases, crave some degree of sociability, need some degree of sociability, even friendship. And that was always, to varying degrees, a problem, because loneliness is inherent in holding power, particularly in holding supreme power, and even more so when that supreme power is also, to some extent, as was almost always true of emperors, conceived of as sacred in one sense or another. And the efforts of emperors to have friends, the efforts of emperors, or not efforts, the way in which emperors sought and found love could have dramatic political consequences. You know, the term favorite, which was official more or less in some political systems, in Spain in particular, in the early modern era, signified that you were simultaneously the emperor's friend, if you like, but also his chief political minister. And of course, friendship in politics is always difficult to manage. Political friendships are fragile. And that is particularly true when the friendship is between two people who are, by definition, entirely unequal. The minister depends entirely on the sovereign monarch. And if, you know, friendship and the monarch's search for friendship can cause tremendous ructions in factional court politics, that is even more true when the emperor becomes besotted with some female. And, you know, much of, well, even policy, let alone the distribution of offices, is strongly influenced by his relationship with his, you know, with his concubine, his mistress, his wife, whatever, etc., etc., etc. Then, you know, emperors are not unlike other human beings in that they look at the stars, they wonder where they and human beings in general came from, they wonder where they will go after they die. In other words, like most human beings who are capable of conscious, self-conscious thought, they wonder about their link to heaven, to the world of the spirits, to their ancestors, etc., 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 etc. Again, this is entirely human and normal. But as with other human and normal traits, it takes on, or can take on, dramatic implications when the human being in question is the ruler of a great empire. The obvious point to mention there is that in certain cases, certain very important cases, emperors were responsible for determining the religion of large regions of the world. And in some cases, that decision has enormous implications which reverberate right down to today. You know, the Emperor Constantine's choice of Christianity is one of the foundation blocks of what we call Western civilization. Perhaps even more dramatically, without the Emperor Ashoka, who lived 500 years before Constantine, Buddhism would probably have disappeared off the map And if it hadn't disappeared off the map entirely, it would probably at best be an obscure sect in North India. Instead, for various reasons, because Buddhism was taken up as the religion of state by a great emperor, who saw it as his role not just to convert and transform his own society under the auspices of the Buddhist faith, but also to proselytize outside his realm, Buddhism has become, over time, the greatest religion in Asia. That doesn't mean that, of course, Ashoka was solely responsible. He wasn't. Things, the history of the next 1,000 years after he died was also hugely responsible for the way things went. But without Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor, I think it is fair to say we would not be talking about the Buddhist religion today. So, as I say, these are very, very major decisions made by individuals 1,000, 2,000 years, 2,200 years ago, if one's talking about Ashoka, which are still of enormous importance. Self-evident when you're talking about human beings is the human life cycle. The child is vulnerable. The child needs protection. The child needs education. The adolescent, the young man, may seek to assert himself. He will lack experience. He may lack caution. His desire to assert himself may also reflect a certain inner lack of confidence. It may, on the contrary, reflect just too much bumptious self-confidence. In any case, these kind of characteristics common in adolescent and young men take on exciting consequences sometimes if you are a young emperor. And again, if one looks over history, it would not surprise you to discover that probably emperors were most effective when they were mature men, combining a degree of experience, an element of caution, an element of knowledge of human beings and indeed of themselves, an element of self-discipline. They were usually at their most effective. And then comes old age with all that implies in terms of loss of facilities, lots of energy, sometimes increasing disillusion, sometimes simply, increasing disinterest, lack of interest in contemporary affairs, politics, and a desire to cultivate one's soul and to think about one's place in the afterlife. Just one example to to a sense, sum up much of this. The Tang dynasty emperor, Xuanzong, one's talking about a man who inherited the throne in 711 of the Common Era and ruled for the next 45 years. Now, Xuanzong was, for the first 35 years of his life, of his reign, an exceptionally effective, competent, and successful emperor. He was also a very impressive human being in cultural terms. The court over which he presided was brilliant in cultural terms, and its influence spread over much of East and even to some extent Southeast Asia. But running an imperial government, like running any government, is an exhausting business. Managing the complicated business of government policy. For instance, trying to feed 1 million people in his capital in an area which was deficit agriculture, short in terms of irrigation, etc., 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 etc. Very complicated. Banging heads together, managing the outsized egos of ministers. Outsized egos go along with being political elite ministers, etc. All very exhausting. And after 35 years, it just, Xuanzong had enough. And essentially, he withdrew from active politics, except, where truly crucial issues were involved, and basically handed over power to his prime minister, who was also a distant cousin, called Liu Fu. also not unlike aging men, unfortunately. Tang Xuanzong sought the elixir of eternal youth in the arms of a beautiful young woman. His concubine wife, whatever you want to call it, young Yuhan. Well, a minor element of his infatuation with this young woman was, for instance, that fresh lychees were delivered to her every day by express post, from 2,000 miles away or whatever in South China. That's relatively minor. Less minor was the fact that she increasingly came to dominate the emperor in terms of patronage and even top-level appointments. So when the prime minister, Liu Fu, died, Tang Xuanzong is persuaded by her to put in her cousin as prime minister. And then the fun begins, because her cousin, as tended to be the way with court politics throughout history, began dismantling the previous prime minister's patronage networks and putting his own clients into positions. That was what politics was mostly about. Unfortunately, among his predecessor's most important clients, and certainly his most important military client, was a general called An Lushan. And An Lushan, like most of the warrior semi-nomadic world, had a strong sense of personal loyalty to his patron, the former prime minister, a sort of loyalty to the dynasty, the Tang dynasty, but first and foremost a loyalty to himself and to his clientele. And once it became clear that the new prime minister was going to kick him out and destroy his network, An Lushan decided to strike first and staged an enormous rebellion, which, though in the end it was semi-defeated, did tremendous damage to the Tang dynasty, damage from which the Tang dynasty never recovered. The Tang dynasty retained control over a core of their empire, but were much less powerful, particularly once you were beyond easy distance of the capital. And so, here you have the story of an aging gentleman thinking about the afterlife, thinking about, the joys of being young again in the arms of a young woman. And a very familiar story plays a huge role in the decline and collapse of China's greatest dynasty. And it's not just, that a dynasty collapses. One immediate result of the rebellion and the shrinking of Tang power is the Chinese withdrawal from Central Asia, where in the previous half century, China and the Islamic Caliphate had been battling for dominion. And it's with the An Lushan rebellion that Central Asia is handed over irrevocably to the Islamic world, to which it belongs to this day. So again, one is looking at political events, even seemingly very trivial political events, like the love of an aging gentleman for a beautiful young woman, which resonate down to this day in terms of very important politics. It matters a great deal that Central Asia is part of the Islamic world, that it is not part of the Sinosphere. All right. So does this suggest that I am arguing for a never-changing human nature? That somehow emperors are fixed, their mentalities, their, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and one can make comparisons gaily across millennia? Well, of course, no and yes, yes and no. I think one way to illustrate how I think you can and how I think you can't make comparisons is to talk about the Roman Emperor Julian. And here one is talking about the second half of the 4th century Common Era, and the Habsburg Emperor, in other words, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, in the second half of the 18th century Common Era. In other words, 1400 years apart. Now, for all that, I think that you can make some comparisons as regards their personalities. For a start, they're both intelligent men, both with an interest in ideas, particularly Julian, who you could describe as an intellectual. They're both impatient men, very anxious to push forward with their ideas and implement their ideas. And they have in their personalities a touch of hysteria when things go badly, when they're confronted with major difficulties. You can make structural comments and comparisons as well between the two men. Unlike most hereditary emperors, both Julian and Joseph II ascend the throne with a radical program of domestic reform at the forefront of their minds. For Julian, the basic radical reform is to roll back the Christianization of the empire, on which his uncle, Constantine I, Constantine the Great, had launched the Roman Empire. Julian is committed to the old pagan gods. He is committed to, at the very least, disestablishing the Christian church and also to weakening it. He regards it as crude, etc., 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 etc. Joseph II is committed to pushing forward the program of the radical Enlightenment in terms of economic reform, social reform, cultural reform. For example, emancipating the serfs. For example, radically reducing the role of the Catholic Church in education, in the economy, etc., etc., etc. So, in both cases, you have radical reformers, and another structural comparison. In both cases, their radical program of domestic reform is partly undermined by their aggressive, ambitious foreign policy. And, therefore, I think comparisons are meaningful. And yet, at the same time, if you're looking at the mental worlds of these two men, they are completely different. Julian is living in the world of sort of Neo-Platonic metaphysics, the world of the Greek ancient gods and myths. Joseph is living in the utilitarian, secular, and scientific mindset of the late Enlightenment. They wouldn't understand each other if they spoke to each other in that sense. All right. So that's the end of my first section. The second is to talk about these men as leaders. Well, it is one of the difficulties of the job they do that they are expected to be leaders in various spheres, forms. They are dynasts, heads of their family, and managing your family is a crucial element in the politics of hereditary monarchy. Equally crucial is managing the elites, not least through the distribution of patronage and through the management of the imperial court as a way in which you keep the elites under your eye, you use them for your purposes, etc., 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 etc. They are, by definition, almost chief political officers of their empires. In other words, they appoint the key ministers at a minimum, they make the key decisions on peace and war, etc., etc. Even Chinese Confucian emperors, who don't, for instance, play another role, usually, which is as commander-in-chief in the field, military leadership. Nevertheless, they do usually reserve for themselves the final word on the big geopolitical, geostrategic issues, peace and war, the top appointments, you name it. Whether an emperor is also a chief executive officer is an interesting question. Chief executive officer, to my mind, in my definition, means managing a complex bureaucratic machinery of government. The Northern Sung emperors are already doing this in the 11th century, Common Era. No European monarch is doing anything approaching that really till the 18th century, and to some extent even the 19th. They are almost by definition, in one sense or another, sacred leaders, semi-religious figures, sometimes even described as high priests. Now, they are these various, they fulfill these various aspects of leadership to varying degrees in different mixes, to some extent from individual to individual, but certainly from dynasty to dynasty, and from one cultural political tradition to another. A Roman emperor, for instance, is a military leader in a way that a Confucian Chinese emperor very seldom is. Right out at one extreme, you have the Japanese emperor. I don't think actually it's correct, really, in comparative terms, to call the Japanese emperor an emperor in my meaning of the term until the Meiji era, but we could talk about that. But certainly his role, not just until, but in fact throughout history, with very brief interlude, is essentially to be a sacred legitimizer, a sacred intermediary between heaven and earth. He is, after all, the descendant of shamans. And real power is traditionally always held in the hands of some kind of initially military ruling dynasty of shoguns. I mean, so Japan is the example of imperial leadership at its weakest and at its most purely sacred and symbolic. It's not unique in that. For the last 500 years of the Abbasid dynasty of caliphs, they occupy the same basic role. They are there to legitimize the rule of military ruling dynasties. So, I mean, you get a sense of the variety of the leadership, forms of leadership, and the complications that the job often entails. It is not easy to combine being a sacred figure, a religious leader, if you like, a political leader, a military commander-in-chief, a dynast, almost the impresario of the imperial court, etc., etc., etc. It is not at all surprising that many of those called upon to fulfill these many roles don't do it very well. Okay. If you want to get insights into what imperial leadership entailed, often the best sources of all are the accounts which a number of key emperors wrote, above all, as guides to their heirs. What the job entailed, what the pitfalls were, what the qualities were which were required to do the job well. Louis XIV's memoirs, among the best. They're not memoirs, they're actually secret instructions for his son, written in the 17th century CE, 900 years, 1,000 years before that. Tang Taizong, wonderful instructions, memoranda for his sons. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor in the 16th, etc., etc. These, for someone like me, trying to get a sense of the job as seen from the inside, are pure gold. You know, in some senses, some of the things that Louis XIV or Tang Taizong says are very relevant to almost any leader, which helps to explain why Tang Taizong's instructions for his son have been translated and published in English by a business school publication. Of course, an emperor is in significant ways different to any contemporary political, let alone business leader. He is, for a start, sacred and solemn. He is not accountable to an electorate, to a board, to shareholders. His ministers serve at his pleasure. No one is his equal, etc., etc. He can't be dismissed, in principle, etc., 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 etc. Nevertheless, as I say, in some ways, this is the job of leadership and the qualities which make for success resonate even for contemporary political leaders. For example, Louis XIV tells his son that if you're going to be an effective ruler, you have to keep in your own hands and open the channels of information and patronage. You must not let any individual or group block off all your sources of information and advice, or they will control you. You must not let anyone else take over the patronage, the business of patronage, because that goes to the, the center of politics, sticks and carrots. All sorts of other, pithy information, which you get repeated actually in a good deal of the business school literature. For instance, a CEO was often told in the business school literature that he must, above all, listen to critics, encourage different views, reward critics. That was true, if that is true of a CEO, how much truer of a hereditary monarch who has a vast amount more patronage as well as coercive power at his disposal. Of course, leadership does inevitably depend on the organization you're leading, the society you're leading, the culture in which you operate, the nature of the political system. The most famous book on royal leadership is Machiavelli's The Prince. And it was of some use to him, but only some, because the basic point is that for Machiavelli, as you can see from all the examples he uses, the princes about whom he is talking are either the Italian despots of his day, none of whom came from old or long-established dynasties, all of whom lacked a basic historical and dynastic legitimacy, or the Roman emperors. And by imperial standards, the dynastic legitimacy in imperial Rome is exceptionally low. No dynasty survives for more than 3 or 4 generations. As Machiavelli himself wrote, the kind of advice he is giving to princes, the kind of warning he's giving to princes, is often inappropriate when the princes in question are the legitimate rulers, legitimate heirs of long-established dynasties. I'll just give you one crucial bit of advice that Machiavelli gives to his princes, which, if applied to hereditary emperors, would be disastrous. He tells them that under all circumstances, they must never let anyone else command their armies, because a successful general will almost inevitably seek to usurp the throne. Now, that is probably true for the great majority of newly coined Italian despots of his day. It was certainly true for Roman emperors. After all, the very word emperor, imperator, in Rome traditionally meant successful general. And the Roman Empire's history is peppered, and the Roman polity's strength is weakened by perpetual military revolutions, attempted coups, you name it, you name it, you name it. The whole point, though, of hereditary legitimate monarchy is that precisely the monarch can trust other men with the command of his armies. He can have a prime minister without fearing that his throne is going to be usurped. And if that is important for all monarchs, it's inevitably doubly important for emperors. Let's just stick to the military sphere. It is in the nature of empire that you're not an empire unless you are a very great power. And you will not be a very great power unless you have large armies. It is also in the nature of empire that it covers a very large territory, and that therefore these armies will be operating a great distance from the capital, a long way from the emperor's eye. Given the fact that empires usually have 3 or 4 long borders where they may be at war, in any case, the emperor has got to devolve military power to generals. He can't be in 4 places at the same time. So, for an emperor, for an empire to survive, it has to manage that old conundrum. How do you have armies which terrify and defeat external enemies, defend your territory, without those armies becoming a threat to your own government? And if you look at the history of empire, well, you find the whole gamut, from the Roman Empire, which, as I say, is constantly racked by military rebellions, all the way out to early modern European empires, in which military revolt against the monarch is almost unheard of. And between the Romans and the early modern Europe, you have, for instance, a whole gamut of Chinese dynasties, some of which manage the business of controlling but also preserving military power much better than others. The Tang, as I already mentioned, were brought down basically by military rebellion. Their successors, the Sung, are so terrified of military rebellion that they constrain the army, put it under civilian control, and very much weaken it in purely professional military terms. The Ming, to a significant degree, do exactly the same, etc., etc., etc. All right, so I have already begun to talk about hereditary monarchy. I suppose the most obvious question to ask, I won't go into it now in any detail, is why it is that a system of government which is so patently flawed. I mean, nobody can believe that if, the key to politics and government is to choose the most able people as leaders, you clearly are not going to achieve that through hereditary monarchy. Obvious to us, that was obvious also to the ancients, not just the ancient Greeks, but the ancient Chinese, the ancient Indian, you name it. Why, therefore, should so seemingly irrational a system nevertheless be the one that dominates most of history? And I think the answers to that are relatively clear. In the first place, for most of history, most people believe that what happened on earth happened because some version of heaven either decreed it or permitted it. So the monarch was a religious sacred figure, an intermediary between humans and heaven, God and earth, whatever you want to call it. He was there to propitiate heaven, to ensure that humans operated in accordance with heaven's principles. Hereditary monarchy also seemed natural. Cobbler succeeded cobbler, cobbler son, cobbler father. Why not rulers too? And since God, at least in the Christian and Islamic legal tradition, had created human beings and human nature, what was natural to humans must in some senses also be divinely supported. God had created humans. God had created humans, and humans needed society in order to live the good life, the full life. And society was almost universally believed needed kings, an arbiter, a defender, etc., etc. Religious principles and pragmatism overlap. For most of history, most political thinkers believed that the alternative to monarchy, hereditary monarchy, was anarchy. Very few political thinkers believed that the mass of the population, uneducated, often seen as wicked or at least weak, desperately seeking to scrape a living, was capable of disciplining even itself, let alone choosing the rulers of the state. As for elected monarchy, this was seen as an invitation to civil war among the elites. When Joseph II's governor, and again, I'm back in the second half of the 18th century, wants to tell his charge, the future emperor, that hereditary monarchy works best, he doesn't bother to talk about God or even natural law. He just says, look, in practice, hereditary monarchy has proved best. And he tells Joseph, look at the only two really remaining hereditary secular monarchies in Europe, Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, both prey to their neighbors. Look at the remaining city-states, powerless. And that, of course, does remind me to just mention the only ancient political tradition which did not, on the whole, support sacred hereditary monarchy, the Greek one, and Aristotle in particular. And yet Aristotle only believes that democracy can work in city-states. And the basic lesson of history is that city-states can't defend themselves in the long run against the far superior resources of kingdoms and empires. The only other thing I will talk about in terms of hereditary monarchy is the place of women. I could talk for the rest of the day about hereditary monarchy. It is one of the key themes of the book. But all I will now talk about is women. The basic point here is that women were second class, second to men in hereditary imperial monarchy, as they were in all pre-modern political systems, save in some, relatively, in inverted commas, primitive systems, and to some extent in Africa. But nevertheless, in hereditary imperial monarchy, women matter a very great deal. And that for three main reasons. The first is that the holy grail of court politics in hereditary monarchy is access to the monarch. Best of all is sole access for significant periods. In the nature of things, the person most likely to have sole access to the emperor for a significant time is his mistress or his sexual partner. In one set of traditions of imperial hereditary monarchy, where you have harems, the emperor can often disappear into the harem for days, if not weeks on end, where he is inaccessible to all men save eunuchs, and very much in the company of his court women. The second point about the power of women is that although women very seldom occupy executive positions in government with direct control over the formulation and execution of policy, they are at the core of the kinship, aristocratic patronage networks, which are the essence of court politics. The basic point is that although in imperial hereditary monarchy, politics is often about policy, it is always about patronage, the spoils of the political system, and women are crucial there. And the third and obvious point is that in hereditary monarchy, the basic core of hereditary monarchy is family writ large, i.e. dynasty. And the principle of succession is by biological reproduction. Now, crafty males in the course of the last 5,000 years have found every kind of way to keep women out of bureaucracies and armies and law courts, you name it. But no male has yet been crafty enough to keep women out of the business of family and reproduction. So, of course, women are there at the centre of politics. And indeed, whether you're talking about Scottish Presbyterian radicals in the 16th century, John Knox, or French Jacobins, or Chinese Confucian officials, all of them hate the role of women in hereditary monarchy and see it as one of the key sources of corruption, misgovernment, you name it. But at the same time, they realize, certainly Chinese Confucian officials did, that the power of women was inherent in the political system. So that leaves me just with empire and very little time to talk about empire, which doesn't really matter because, to be perfectly honest, about half the books I ever wrote were directly or indirectly about empire, including one 600-page book about the concept of empire and a sort of also a comparative history of empire. If you gave me 6 hours, I couldn't do justice to the topic. All I think probably I will say here is that, when you're talking about empire in my context, the context of this book and talk, you do have to be a little bit wary, because the basic assumptions about what empire is in our world tend to be assumptions drawn from the history of the modern transoceanic maritime empires, particularly the West European ones, with the British Empire top of the list. Now, the empires ruled over by my emperors did actually include one or two of these great empires, the Spanish Empire, an obvious example, the Portuguese Empire, the British Empire. Nevertheless, most of the empires I studied are great Eurasian land empires. They do have much in common with the great transoceanic empires. The three key elements in my definition of empire are vast space, great diversity, above all multi-ethnicity, and first and foremost, enormous power. Remembering that power is not just military or political or economic power, it's also cultural power. Remember the point I made, for 1500 years, nomads are on the whole militarily superior to sedentary societies. The greatest of all nomadic empires, in a sense, is the Mongols. In comparison to the nomadic power of the Eurasian steppe, the amount of power which the Arabian nomads can mobilize is significantly less. And yet in the long run, the caliphate, which is formed by the combination of two great sources of power, military nomadism and the enormous mobilizing and uniting power of a new charismatic religion, Islam. The caliphate is much more significant in history because it creates and carries through its crucial, vulnerable first 200 years, Islamic civilization. And the existence of Islamic civilization across a great swathe of the world today is owed to a great extent to the caliphate, whereas the impact of the Mongol Empire on our contemporary world is much more limited. In other words, it is the ideological cultural power of the caliphate, which in the long run is more important than its still significant military power. Okay. All I think I would say right now is that if you are making comparisons between the great Eurasian land empires, most of them, not all, and the transoceanic modern European empires, the cultural realm is probably the most significant difference. One of the key elements in Western imperialism is cultural hegemony. I wouldn't go as far as Edward Said. Many Orientalists were deeply respectful and indeed sometimes preferred the societies they studied to modern bourgeois society. But basically, Western imperialism has no doubt about its absolute cultural superiority, the inferiority of non-white cultures, etc., 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 sees itself as the embodiment of progress and modernity. And this is at the core of the post-colonial critique, the post-colonial historiographical school, etc., etc. When you're getting to the great Eurasian empires, most of which are founded either by nomadic dynasties or dynasties whose roots lie in nomadism, more or less, then you have a completely different set of cultural patterns. Indeed, very often it is the nomadic military conquerors who are to a great extent conquered by the great sedentary civilizations of Asia, Chinese, Persian, Indian, you name it. Certainly the interaction between these great Eurasian dynasties and the sedentary societies they conquer and rule is absolutely fascinating. I think in many ways the most fascinating aspect of my book for me. When you look at Akbar, for instance, the Mughal emperor in India, and the wonderful combined Persianate, Sanskrit, and also Timurid high culture that he patronizes, wonderful. Kangxi and Yongzheng as well in the in Qing dynasty China, etc., 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 etc. This is a basically different path to the one that you're used to if you look just at the West European empires. What's the difference between an emperor and a king? It's fundamentally one of status. An emperor is in some traditions, the Persian one, for instance, quite literally the king of kings. When the German Empire was founded in 1871, the most basic reason for calling its ruler the King of Prussia, German Emperor, was to assert his superior status over the kings of Saxony, Württemberg, and Bavaria. It was also to assert a continuity with the old Holy Roman emperors of the German nation. Increasingly also, it was part and parcel of the era of high imperialism, when it was considered that only an empire would stand at the top table of international relations and play a significant role in determining the future fate of mankind. An empire needed an emperor, and therefore to make your ruler an emperor was to assert that you were one of history's and the future's leading and defining powers. So that, I think, is where I will end. I mean, one reason why I studied emperors, not just ordinary kings, is because emperors mattered more. And I've tried to show ways in which emperors did make great political, but also cultural, religious decisions, which remain of fundamental importance today. Simply because of the enormous resources they controlled, emperors were more likely to be able to sustain great high cultures and civilizations. Empires and imperial courts were, by definition, great multi-ethnic, multicultural meeting places, and therefore played very significant roles in the transmission of ideas in history. Was that the only reason I studied emperors? No, not at all. A most basic reason was that many of them were truly fascinating human beings, and they were human beings doing a job which strained, as you might say, human faculties to their utmost. So it is a very dramatic and fascinating biographical story. But of course, that is one thing I simply can't talk about in the course of a 50-minute lecture. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor LIEVEN, for this fascinating romp through world history, and in a sense, even a trans-historical story that you were telling that was more about like systematizing, perhaps, the roles that emperors and empresses could take on. So I think we have a lot of food for thought, and before we go into discussion, we will now have a comment by Professor HANEDA on the topic of the lecture. So please, Professor HANEDA.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor LIEVEN, for your fascinating lecture. Your wide range of knowledge on the world's history, on the world's past, is really remarkable and impressive. Also, could you start the slides of my PowerPoint? No, it doesn't work. Oh, yeah. So now I want to show you on the front page of your book. Although I didn't have enough time to read through this important book on emperors, I'm sure it is an important work we should refer to anytime we discuss on empires and emperors from now on. In your book and today's lecture, you have the courage of overviewing the history of the world from ancient time to the present, mainly by focusing emperors and their life. Some people may criticize you. How dare you did such an audacious attempt? Timeline of world history is too long, and its spatial framework is too large for a single researcher, as you have already said in your lecture. However, I am an enthusiastic supporter of your challenge. To clarify some aspects of a specific time and space by exploring various historical sources is often considered to be historians' main work. It may be true, but at the same time, somebody should make a framework and a context which overarch all these individual detailed works and show how we can understand world history. That is exactly what you did in your wonderful book and today's lecture. I admire your great efforts, and just like you, I demonstrated a part of my perspective on world history by supervising and editing 20 volumes of world history, which you can see on the screen in manga recently.
In manga.
It was hard work, but I understand well now how interesting and challenging it is for a historian to draw a meaningful sketch related to world history for children. If you allow it to me, we are camarades. If I can use this word. Having said that, I would like to make 3 comments on your excellent lecture and ask some questions. The first question is very simple, and you have already mentioned a little bit about this question. Who were emperors? You pointed out 4 key elements to characterize or feature emperors. They were human beings, leaders, hereditary monarchs, and they faced to rule empires. I totally agree that these 4 points are important to define who were emperors, but I'm not sure if these are both necessary and sufficient conditions. I'd like to point out that the only difference between emperors and other monarchs like kings among these 4 elements is the last one, ruling empires. Whether they ruled empires or other forms of polity like kingdoms. Other 3 elements can be also applied to other monarchs like kings. Then we need to understand the difference between empires and the kingdom to know precisely who are emperors. However, it seems that there is no clear explanation, as you have already mentioned in your lecture, between empires and kingdom. A huge number of studies have done to discuss empires until now, including yours at the left-hand side of your screen. Empires, Russian Empire, the Russian Empire, and its rivals. Even in Japanese, we have an important collected volume of empire studies at your right-hand side, published in 2023. Still, we don't know how to define the empire correctly and clearly. So I should say that the line between emperors and kings is not always clear. In fact, you mentioned French King Louis XIV to explain emperors some features, but he's usually called a king, not an emperor. You regard Ashoka of ancient India as emperor, but we don't call him emperor in Japan, but just king. Although you argue that emperor was king of kings, these examples show that there is no fundamental difference between emperors and kings. Is my understanding so far correct? It may be meaningless to ask who emperors were, but if so, a question is raised: who has the right to decide a given monarch is an emperor, not a king? This is the first part of my comments. And second one is on your view. You just give some overview on the 2 types of empires, and you said that for most people in today's world, the word empire means the modern European transoceanic empires. And these empires are taken almost unconsciously to be the paradigm of empires. I'm not totally convinced by this view, especially when your today's topic, emperor, comes to my mind. The modern European transoceanic empires really the paradigm of all empires in history? Maybe my doubt is because I studied the Safavid Empire for my doctoral dissertations more than 40 years ago, but maybe it comes from that my experience. But anyway, the modern, in my view, the modern European empires had sometimes no emperor. Let's think of the French Empire. During 30 years in the 19th century, it had indeed emperors, Napoleon I and Napoleon III. However, it even had no monarch after 1871. In case of the British Empire, it is true that Queen Victoria reigned in the heyday of the British Empire, and she was called Empress of India. But maybe I'm wrong, but so far as I know, she was the queen and not called Empress of the whole British Empire. Like this, the modern European empires could exist without emperor. Isn't an emperor indispensable for an empire? I'm sure it is. Empires and the emperors are one set, in my view. The modern European empires discovered something which could replace emperors. However, that was the beginning of the end of the political and social system called empire. What do you think about my thoughts like this? This is the second part of my comments. And the third comment is on the Japanese emperor. Today you just touched very little the Japanese emperor, but since we are in Japan, I have the right to mention, to discuss the case of Japanese emperor. In your book, not today, but in your book, you write that the only, so I forgot the slides, this one, and the Japanese emperor. In your book, you write that the only emperor still reigning on earth is the Japanese monarch, Naruhito, at page 4. And so far as we discuss in English, that is true. However, when we discuss the same issue in Japanese, it is certain that many Japanese have a different view, because they don't think their monarch is an emperor in its English meaning of the term. This is what you said already in your lecture. In Japanese, the term equivalent with emperor is kotei, but the Japanese call their monarch not kotei, but tenno. Tenno is used only to mean the Japanese monarch. In other words, kotei is a general noun, while tenno is a proper noun. If you call in Japanese, the Japanese monarch kotei, that is emperor in English, and count Japan as an empire, teikoku, empire's equivalent term in Japanese, most Japanese people will be upset. Because teikoku contains some negative sense, just like empire, often connected to the imperialism in English. Also, a kotei emperor is often linked with the military invasion and despotism. They believe Japan is not an empire anymore, and their tenno is similar with kings in several European countries. The problem may be that the Japanese monarch keeps retaining the title of tenno, which were translated into emperor before the Second World War. I have no intention to say that your understanding is problematic. I just want to point out that this is a good example. Historical interpretations could be different from one language, one country to another. Indeed, it is very difficult to define who are emperors in this respect. And one more point, the last point I'd like to make in connection with the Japanese emperor is that the ancestors of today's emperor were not always regarded as emperor by Westerners in the past. Please read this text, which was originally in French, and I add Japanese English translation. It appears in an article, diary or dialogue in Encyclopedia by Diderot and D'Alembert, famous encyclopedia of the Age of Enlightenment, published in the middle of the 18th century. The text tells that Japanese empire had two chiefs, Dairi and Kubo. Dairi means tenno in today's world, who was in Kyoto, and Kubo means Tokugawa shogun, who was in Edo, today's Tokyo. This text is based on the observation of Engelbert Kempfer, who stayed in Nagasaki in 1890 to 92 as a physician to the Dutch East India Company's trading post. According to him, the emperor of Japan, when he was in Japan, was not Dairi, the ancestor of a contemporary tenno, but Kubo, Tokugawa shogun, who possessed great military power. This means that, at least for the eyes of Westerners, the title of emperors moved from Tokugawa shogun to Meiji Tenno after the Meiji Restoration or Revolution in 1868. The move coincides with the process of transforming Japan into a sovereign nation state of modern European style. So it is ironical that Japan needed a strong emperor anew at that moment, while emperors were losing their traditional role and power in European transoceanic empires. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lieven. Before you answer, one quick note for our audience. I think we have some time for Q&A, so perhaps we can answer one or two, or Professor Lieven can answer one or two questions. So please use the Q&A function down here in the Zoom menu and write some while Professor Lieven answers the comments by Professor Hane. Thank you so much. And sorry, Professor Lieven.
Not at all. Thank you so much. I mean, in terms of empires and kingdoms, or emperors and kings, I mean, yes, indeed, the fact that there isn't a sharp distinction, or there often isn't, it was part of the book, you know, an emperor is precisely a leader, but also a hereditary monarch. And most of what he does and the roles he plays, he would be playing if he was a mere king. Nevertheless, firstly, I would say that in principle, there are distinctions simply because, you know, he is a king writ large. He has more resources, he is ruling a great power, except, you know, he can sustain a vast, impressive court, and at the same time, he has a bigger resonance in history, probably. When one is talking about the distinction between an emperor and a mere king, it also, of course, does depend on the context. There is, for example, a very clear and very determinedly made and stressed, emphasized contrast in China in the 3rd century BCE, when the first emperor creates his empire, and he goes out of his way to stress that although I was the king of Qin, this is now an entirely different era because I am realizing the age-old desire of Chinese literati to create a unified, etc., etc., etc. Then you move out to Europe, where the Holy Roman Emperor is usually less powerful, less magnificent, you name it, than the King of France. And of course, that, you know, there one is touching on something which is enormously important: the fact that empire has predominated in East Asia over the last 2,000 years and still does. Whereas in Western Europe, where 2,000 years ago you had an empire, Rome, the basic tradition since has been multipolarity. So all of that, no problem at all with me. Yes, absolutely. Once one is dealing with, you know, terminology, of course, one never dares be too dogmatic. I mean, you know, I'm using the word emperor in the English language. You can, I think, fairly enough trace that back to Roman imperator and the various European, but at the very same time that well, you know, before Rome had an emperor, you know, the first emperor of China is calling himself Huangdi, which we talk of as emperor, and in what other name would you give it? And yet, of course, you know, the difference between the two terms, imperator and Huangdi, immediately tells you fundamental things about the different conception of emperorship. Imperator is a general. The Roman emperor is probably first and foremost a military leader. Huangdi has all sorts of cosmic, sacred, you know, and it stresses that on the whole, the primary role of the Chinese emperor in history is as performer of rituals, legitimizer, etc. There's a big area between. The Roman emperor is also a rather third-class god very often, and the Huangdi is also the chief political officer usually. So it's not black and white, but you can see the distinctions there. And of course, one has to be sensitive about this terminology all the way down. And that would, you know, be true of what you said about tenor as well. I mean, my own view, and I said this in the book, is the only time when you can describe Japan as an empire, in the sense that, you know, I'm talking about empires, is the Meiji era down to 1945. And there, clearly, the Japanese polity is modeling itself on European transoceanic empires, but with some very interesting specifics. I mean, you know, the Japanese invest more in Manchukuo in the 1930s than Britain does in the entire history of British India. You've got there a more consolidated perception of empire than certainly you have in the much more loosely united British Empire, etc., 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 etc. I mean, as to whether you can have an empire without an emperor, yes, of course you can. Republican Rome, which was an empire,
which was an empire
for 200 years before it became a, you know, a monarchy. You can say longer than that. And the French Empire, you know, the Republican Empire in modern terms. I mean, I think probably, certainly with the European maritime empires, you could argue that it was in a sense a bit more logical to have an emperor if you were going to have an empire, and an emperor was a better symbol for a vast imperial edifice than some republic proclaiming liberty, fraternity, and equality, you know. Given the fact that most of the non-white societies over which they were ruling had traditions of sacred monarchy, given that they were, you know, pre-modern by definition, deeply hierarchical, etc., 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 you could understand why, you know, the symbolism of monarchy fitted them better than some kind of republican version. But that's a relatively trivial, you know, point. I mean, when I said that the dominant, almost unconscious understanding of empire is very much rooted in the history of the West European maritime empires, particularly the British one. Of course, I was not talking about academic discourse. That debate, obviously, you know, historians of China have China up there, you know. I was more talking about mass consciousness, and certainly mass consciousness in North America, Western Europe, and to a great extent, I suspect, Africa. You know, the whole business of Black Lives Matter, slavery, post-colonial studies, all of this is all rooted in the West European maritime tradition. As is, you know, debate about the gap between First and Third World, which of course has tremendous political resonance still, and is, you know, very important also in terms of debates about reparations and climate change and God knows what. So that's all I meant, you know. In terms of, I think the second question, I mean, it's, you know, this was my last chapter really. You know, talking about emperors an empire in the, you know, the modern age, which I take to be, I'm rather a traditional sort. I take that fundamentally to mean the era of the enormous economic, social, and cultural changes brought in by the Industrial Revolution, and then the ideas which were inherited and proclaimed worldwide above all by the French Revolution. I mean, the basic point is that they make hereditary imperial monarchy redundant, essentially. You cannot sustain traditional hereditary imperial monarchy in the modern era, I think, in the face of those values, except possibly in a sort of Japanese sense. You could, if you could have a hereditary emperor who played a purely symbolic role, then perhaps that's different. You know, if well, I could go on about this forever.
How do you explain the case of British crown, which was once a symbol of empire,
Yeah.
and then now it has been transformed into just a royal family?
It started, but after all, long before it was the symbol of empire, monarchy, hereditary, you know, it's the same dynasty. They took on added, some added functions, and above all, an added glory and legitimacy and grandeur. And they haven't entirely shed that, you know, by the standards of the Scandinavian monarchies, or indeed by the Japanese monarchy. You only had to look at the late Queen's funeral to realize that, you know, admittedly, this was a special case, but there are still.
But they have been always king and queen,
Yeah.
not emperor.
Well, no, but emperors of India, after all. And also, you know, again, one's terminology. The monarchy certainly, you know, as part of its campaign to survive, but also to boost its relevance and its stature in the modern era, did very much adopt the cause of empire. And, you know, and the empire gave the monarchy both a greater grandeur, you know, these Indian princes bowing and scraping and imperial contingents, but also, of course, a real significance as well, in the sense that the white dominions were to really independent countries. The only institutional link as such was the crown. And the crown, you know, was remarkably successful as a legitimizing and unifying principle. Well, one thing, you know, I had in the book, you know, George VI, after the abdication, which was a threat of Edward VIII in 1936, partly because it did hit at the legitimacy and the prestige of the only institution which united the empire at a time when Britain absolutely needed the support of the white dominions faced by, you know, geopolitical crisis facing Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the first thing the British do, more or less, is to send George VI off to Canada. And it's very interesting looking at the newsreels. There's wonderful newsreels of, you know, his long trip across the whole of Canada, and the, you know, the impact it had. It's very, very fascinating. So there is also the element there of, you know, genuine hard power. You have to remember the Canadian Navy took over the Western North Atlantic, essentially, in the Battle of the Atlantic. And of the two British armies which invaded Northern Europe in 1944, one was Canadian. Yeah. So when he's talking about the hardest of hard power as well, linked to this symbolism. I mean, as to, you know, Japan, well, I've sort of partly already talked about this by saying that, you know, I don't think of the Japanese emperor as being an emperor in comparative terms, except in that period from, you know, I mean, the fascinating thing there was that, I mean, the monarchy was hugely important, partly because it allowed the Meiji reformers to carry out very radical reforms drawn from abroad, but in the name of restoring the power of Japan's most ancient institution in a way. So that was in terms of legitimacy, but of course it was also crucial for them that at a time when, for good or bad reasons, they deeply feared democracy and were not merely conceded, they didn't, you know, believe in popular sovereignty. The only real alternative, and this was true in Europe as well, was traditional dynastic monarchical sovereignty, which is, you know, why the Japanese reformers borrowed a combination of Austrian and German constitutions. But of course, they also then suffered the great drawback of the German constitution, which is the hole at the center of government, you know. And if that was true in Germany, where the Hohenzollerns, at least in principle, had a tradition of ruling, it was even more true in Japan, where not merely had the monarchy never ruled, but none of the Meiji reformers, nor indeed the Emperor Meiji himself, ever conceived of himself as a chief executive officer, you know, which means you have an even bigger hole at the center of the Japanese government than you do of the German one. And I think that does help to explain why, you know, Germany blunders into the First World War, partly because they don't coordinate diplomatic, military, naval, and domestic policy. And Japan does that on an even grander scale in the 1930s, you know. I don't personally think, I mean, you know, this is to enter into a contentious, of course, area here in Japan. Personally, I think that blaming the Emperor Hirohito for, you know, the descent into the Second World War makes very little sense. You can, to some extent, blame Vittorio Emanuele in Italy. He did actually choose Mussolini. But sort of, you know, Hirohito was sort of standing on the bridge of his battleship and it was sort of flooded from below, you know, in my view. I mean, he was facing, I mean, again, you know, people talk about protecting the emperor, but the whole of modern politics is protecting the dignity of the sovereign, which nowadays is the people. I mean, there was very considerable support in Japan for, those policies. And there was very considerable support among Japanese intellectuals for the idea that Japan should lead Asia's revolt against European domination. And you can well understand why there should have been such support. And there was tremendous support in the lower and middle ranks of the officer corps, and of course, there was tremendous support for these policies in the imperial family itself, So he was in a very, very difficult position. And on top of that, given the dynastic tradition and given what had happened to the Romanovs, he was not inclined to take an independent political role. But I must shut up and let people ask questions. Yeah.
Yes, perhaps if I could follow up with one question that kind of seems to suggest itself. So I think there's this part of what you've been discussing is also the classical, or related to the classical tension between agency and structure. And of course, if we think about contemporary history of empire, then there's a lot of focus, I think, on structure, right? On like the conditions that allow for empire, be it the bureaucracy, be it things like informal empire or the consent of the ruled, and so on. And of course, your book is called The Emperor in World History, so it places a focus on agency, biography, and so on. So I think the more boring question would perhaps be like where would you situate it? Yeah. But the more interesting version of it is perhaps to ask in your systematic style, what kind of conditions, looking at like the big like world historical view that you have, what kinds of conditions allow for more agency? What kinds of conditions in a constraint?
We'll discuss this. I mean, perhaps slightly less systematically than I should do, but look, fundamentally, it seems to me. Well, of course, I'm the last person to deny the importance of structure. I wrote this 600-page book about it, and of course, it's nonsense. Would be nonsense. Where I think emperors, but actually, kings as well in similar circumstances, though with less usually important consequences, where they were most likely to play a role was firstly on big decisions in terms of foreign policy and military, because those were absolutely and quintessentially the business of government. There were virtually no political systems of any sophistication which don't reserve those, for the monarch. And in most political systems, if he gave orders to his generals, they would obey. It's more complicated when you're talking about domestic policy, invested interests, and God only knows what, So I would say, on the whole, questions of peace and war, grand strategy, top-level military appointments, though top-level political appointments as well, very much the area of agency. The other obvious, structural point one could make about times of crisis. Crisis management. At that point, very often the supreme leader, simply it becomes vital, how he operates. There's a wonderful quote from a character called Yuri Pines, who was one of the most interesting historians of imperial China, making a general comment that, often at times of crisis, which brought down dynasties, you'd got emperors who were thoroughly at sea, bewildered, couldn't understand what was going on, isolated at court, couldn't control court factions, wavered, and contributed to the collapse of their dynasties, Well, that sounds to me, and I make this comparison, a very good description of Louis XVI's role in the collapse of the French monarchy. I mean, I make a slightly cheapy point, but I think if his brother-in-law, Leopold II, had inherited the French throne, there probably wouldn't have been a revolution, because Leopold was a man who managed crisis decisively, So I mean, those kind of issues, I would say, but also, it depends. But I mean, you can look at some decisions made, even in the political military realm, by emperors many centuries ago, which are still of decisive importance in contemporary politics. I mean, I think, Kangxi and his decision not to stop at the Yangtze, but to conquer southern China. Remember that the Qing, the Manchus, are the heirs of the Zhongas, who never conquered south of the Yangtze. His decision to launch his armies south of the Yangtze very nearly ended in disaster. If his dynasty had not, conquered the enormous resources of southern China, would China be united today? Without the resources of southern China, or China south of the Yangtze, would the Qing have been able to drive all the way into Xinjiang and conquer it?
Thank you very much for that. I think that connects to, I want to bring up one question that I got here. I think it connects to the question of leadership again. And so we have two questions that are kind of related to leadership here that I'll ask together because we have 5 minutes left. So one would be, based on past history, what do you think should be done to educate children about the leadership they will need in the future? Is there anything we can learn for contemporary leadership from autocratic monarchs? And that's my spin on it. I'm sorry about that. And the second part is, what do you think the role of king or emperors in the 21st century could be? Could it be more significant in the government of the country as the prime minister, for example?
Okay. Educating children in terms of leadership. Look, there's a big debate which has always existed somewhere in the, in the world, but now is very much concentrated in business schools, whether you can educate leadership, leadership qualities, or whether they are simply innate. And one of the most interesting ways I think you can look at that is by looking at the education of the heirs to imperial monarchy, which I did in some detail. And it is absolutely fascinating. And it's, it is not easy to get hold of a child and educate them to be a sacred autocratic sovereign. In the first place, you have to instill in them an enormous sense of responsibility. After all, once they're on the throne, no human being has a right to correct or contradict them. They have access to every temptation, vice, luxury you could imagine. And if they go haywire, they could destroy not just the dynasty, but the society, and some do. So you have to inculcate this enormous sense of responsibility. But at the same time, it's no good just sort of beating them into a sense of responsibility and, obedience, because these have got to be tough decision makers. So it is a hell of a challenge, and it's very, very interesting to watch how they go about it and the extent to which, it does or doesn't succeed. It has to be said that once they come to the throne, if they are in a long-established legitimate dynasty, then they will have many crutches, which a modern leader would not have. Deep legitimacy, institutional structures surrounding them, etc., etc. But it is a conundrum, and it's a fascinating one. And yes, I do think it has some implications for today. As for the role of hereditary monarchs in the 21st century, a traditional hereditary legitimate monarch is not just a strongman, a contemporary strongman. Do I think that hereditary monarchy has a major role to play in the traditional sense in the 21st century? Not at all. Not at all. It is actually quite fascinating to see the ways in which hereditary transfer of power still operates even in some Republican setups, and even in one which claims to be communist, which is North Korea, which gives you some insights as to why the hereditary principle, even in an entirely, you'd have thought, wrong ideological context, can still work out. No, I think, I can imagine that given the enormous strains that the next two generations are going to go through in terms of the implications of climate change in particular, plus, we have potentially the biggest challenge to Anglophone predominance in the world in 300 years with China. Combine those and you're going to have societies, populations, and governments under immense pressure. Well, respected constitutional monarchs as symbols of unity and of some kind of long-term continuity, not bad. And also the monarchies traditionally represented, societies in which self-sacrifice, duty, discipline, particularly military. So, I mean, the old Queen of Britain, the late Queen, perfectly embodied all of that. Well, we may need rather a lot of that, actually, facing the kind of crises which are coming up.
Thank you. I think this is a very, very nice closing statement. And with this, I would like to close today's session. And I would like to thank once again Professor LIEVEN for his fantastic lecture and Professor HANEDA for his thought-provoking comments. And I would also like to thank the audience for staying with us and being with us in this session. And please join us again for our future events. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Good.